Hello everyone, it's Mark Godacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 93 and it's a crossover episode with the New Testament review. Hello everyone, it's Mark Godacre here from the NT Pod.
And Ian Mills from the NT Review podcast.
And Laura Robinson from the NT Review.
Now, we came up with the idea of getting together to do a crossover podcast, partly because being locked down for weeks on end makes one go a little stir crazy, but also because people are listening to podcasts more than commonly. And I was out for a walk one day listening to Ian and Laura's NT Review podcast, and I heard their wonderful feedback episode. And my first thought was, oh my goodness, I could do something like that. And then a little later on, I thought, even better, I would love to get a crossover episode together with Ian and Laura. So we came up with a plan together that we would have one episode of the NT Pod on which Ian and Laura guest, and one episode of the NT Review on which I guest. And this is the first of those things. For anyone not familiar with Ian and Laura, shall I just say a very brief introduction to them? They have a wonderful podcast called the NT Review. They are both fifth-year PhD students in the New Testament track at the graduate program in religion at Duke University, but I'm sure that you all know their voices by now. So welcome, Ian and Laura, to the NT Pod.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Wonderful to be here.
Now, we thought we would have a fairly loosely structured conversation, also known as a geek out. Now, if you're having a geek out, you need to have a topic, and we came up with the idea. I think actually it might have been, was it your idea, Ian?
I think so.
Yeah, it was Ian.
Yes.
Okay. So we came up with this idea, Ian came up with this idea, which Laura and I both liked, of talking about adaptations of the Jesus story in all sorts of different ways, in film, fiction, from ancient to modern, hence from Juvencus to Jesus Christ Superstar.
That alliteration works a lot better if you pronounce the J of Juvencus wrong.
Oh, great. Yes, it does, doesn't it? Yes, exactly. Yes, quite. Yes. So it might look better when it's written down, I suppose.
I hope so.
Great. Now, Laura, you've had your own interesting experience. Talking of people who are going stir crazy from being locked down, you've had your interesting experience of looking at adaptations of the Jesus story. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've actually, Jesus adaptations have sort of been a weird theme of quarantine for me. And feel free to jump in with comments or thoughts whenever you have one. I've been taking a lot of quarantine time to read long books. Just that's been sort of my little spiritual devotion. And I guess, I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek because, most of them are not spiritual at all. But I recently reread the book Ben-Hur by Lew Wallace. It's in Indiana. It was written in Indiana, which is sort of my personal connection to it. I'm from Indiana originally, but Ben-Hur was sort of one of the first major blockbuster novels in American literature after Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's a story of a man named Judah Ben-Hur who is he's a Jewish prince. He is from a wealthy family, and he runs afoul of the Romans and sort of has this rags to riches redemption narrative adventure as he goes from a slave to winning the favor of a Roman soldier, being adopted, and eventually getting revenge on the people who hurt him. But his whole life intersects with Jesus, right? And most people will probably be familiar with the Ben-Hur story, probably not from the original novel, but from the Charlton Heston movie in 1957? 57 or 59. I can't.
Sounds right.
Yeah, I can't always. I mix up those numbers.
Yeah, I thought. I actually thought that was what Ben-Hur was.
Yeah.
I thought it was just that film.
No.
I didn't know there was any more to it. I'm ashamed to say.
No, it was originally written by a Union general who was basically blamed for the fallout of the Battle of Shiloh in the Civil War. This Battle of Shiloh had tremendous casualties on both sides, and Lew Wallace was a general at that battle and was sort of the fall guy. So his whole life kind of became a reconsideration of the role of violence in war, and in Christian piety after that. So, and one of the products of that was that he wrote Ben-Hur. So, I don't. Yeah, I'm trying to find a way to not just monologue about Ben-Hur.
Well,
but it's an interesting piece of American literature, I think, in that it introduces the question of how much can you make up in the life of Jesus and still have sort of public Christian support. And this is something that I think comes up in a lot of Jesus adaptations. Is it okay to write dialogue for Jesus? Is it okay to write scenes in Jesus's life that are not attested in the synoptic gospels, right? And this is something that I think Christians have been struggling with, or not struggling with, but thinking about in their media for millennia, right?
Yeah, I actually often think to myself that the great success of the film Ben-Hur in the late 50s is consonant also with the fact that one of the other really successful Jesus films from that era is The Robe, which is all about what happened to Jesus's robe after the crucifixion, resurrection. And like Ben-Hur, it kind of works because it's telling a story off camera, so you don't have to stare at Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, in the film Ben-Hur, I don't know what the novel's like, and in fact there's a more recent Ben-Hur as well, isn't there, which I must have not seen. But in the classic film of Ben-Hur, you only see Jesus from the back. So, I mean, you see him on the cross in the distance, so you actually don't get a sense of exactly what he looked like.
You never hear his voice either.
Right, yeah. Right. So, and as soon as you start switching in the 60s with things like King of Kings and Greatest Story Ever Told to full Jesus on screen up front, audiences kind of balked a bit. I mean, it was like, well, that's not what Jesus looks like in my head, you know.
Yeah, that's not how he sounds. That's not how he talks.
Right,
yeah.
And that's not how he sounds, yeah. And especially in Greatest Story Ever Told, which, I mean, for those not familiar, is 1964, directed by George Stevens. And that has Max von Sydow as Jesus. In fact, he recently died.
He did.
Von
I was
Sydow.
really, I mean, he had a good long life, but he's, obviously a completely legendary actor. It's a tremendous loss.
Right. And but it's one of my least favorite of his roles.
Yeah.
He sounds so weird. And I can see why people going to the cinema to see it thought, oh gosh, that Jesus is not at all like I imagine him.
Yeah. That principle makes good sense of the wild success of the life of Brian among American Christians, right?
Right.
Where Jesus only appears as a murmur, which Brian interprets as the blessed are the cheesemakers.
Right. I tell you, there's a lovely wrinkle on that appearance of Jesus at the beginning of Life of Brian. It's played by an actor called Kenneth Copeland, who was a minor British actor that used to appear in soap operas and things like that. And he actually looks like, because you do get one close-up of him before the camera pans back, and he looks just like Robert Powell. He's made it to look like Robert Powell's really? Jesus of Nazareth. And there's no question that one of the things, it was no question in my mind anyway, that one of the things they were trying to do is make that Jesus for 2 seconds be the Jesus of Nazareth Jesus, they treat him reverentially. And then as soon as you've backed away from that Jesus, then we go on with the rest of the story with Brian and his life. And that is, in a way, it's the same principle as Ben-Hur, as The Robe, or even the film Barabbas, which again tells the Jesus story from a completely different angle than just here's Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
Right. The talk about Ben-Hur makes you sound very sophisticated and intellectual, which you are, for the record. At the same time,
I have a trashy side, though.
At the same time,
don't we all?
You've recently gone viral about Assassination 8033.
Yeah, so this
is that what it's
called? Okay, so this is my husband and I have a tremendous weakness for cheesy Christian movies. And I never quite ran in the circles where those were normative, but I was definitely always, I've been adjacent to them for a very long time. So movies like, I have absolutely seen all the God's Not Dead movies and all of the, those sorts of things. But
and just to chip in, just to be clear, when Laura says my husband, she's not talking about Ian.
No, yeah, that's the thing that we have to clarify every 3 or 4 episodes on the New Testament review. But no, my husband John DePue. But we I can't even remember how we found this thing, but it ended up being a fascinating companion piece to Ben-Hur, which really tries very hard not to invent anything about Jesus, and tries very hard to, in the novel Ben-Hur, Jesus never has any lines that aren't directly from the King James Version. They try very hard to be very faithful to the life of Jesus, and how standards of Christian piety have changed from the late 19th century, because we've found this movie. It's called Assassin 33 AD. I think I've got the order of those words right. They don't make any sense no matter what order you put them in. But it is an action movie where Islamic fundamentalists conscript some American scientists to invent time travel for them so they can go back in time and kill Jesus before the resurrection is a line from the movie, which I don't know what they mean when they say that. But their plan is they're going to kill Jesus before the resurrection so they can stop Christianity in its tracks. So these American scientists go back to go fight the fundamentalists, and there's modern weaponry and night vision goggles and automatic weapons and all sort of the staples of a 2020 American action film, but it's all set in ancient Jerusalem. And as this story goes along, spoiler warning for people who want to see Assassin 33 AD, the time travelers all end up taking the major roles in the Passion story. So the thieves on the cross who are crucified to Jesus' right and left are the assassins who went to go try to kill him. And Simon of Cyrene is one of the time travelers who his name is Simon, and he helps Jesus carry his cross. And the person mocking Jesus and saying to come down from the cross is this lifelong skeptic. And in the part of being a time travel movie, they can keep going through and do the Passion story several different times, right? Because they can just keep going back, which is how you get these absolutely wild shots of Jesus being shot in the head, which is just completely baffling. But it really is fascinating that this movie clearly came out of a very American evangelical sensibility, right? But just makes a complete hash of the Passion and Resurrection story, and doesn't really seem to see any tension between piety for the original story and positing that there actually weren't any angels at the resurrection. They were time travelers with glow sticks, and doesn't think this is an impious thing to suggest. It's absolutely fascinating. So that's that's a.
Huh.
When does the film date?
I think
from?
last year. Yeah, it's a very recent film,
and it's right, and it's a sort of straight to video.
Apparently it had a limited release at some small theaters. I assume to make it to make it eligible for Academy Awards. That's a joke, but but apparently it did stream. There was a time where you could see Jesus get shot in the head on the big screen. I don't know where or when it happened, but it's available on Amazon if anyone wants to. It's.
No.
I have endless fascination for American Christian kitsch, so I found it very interesting. But I understand if other people don't share my tastelessness. So
I think I'm intrigued enough to watch it. I think you've
might have
piqued
to
my
put this on
interest
a
enough.
syllabus in the future, Mark.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I mean, as Laura and Ian know, I teach a film on... as Laura and Ian know, I teach a course on Jesus in film. And the hardest thing about that course is deciding which films to cover, because if you're not careful, it can be incredibly boring if you have back-to-back different versions of the Jesus story. And when I first taught this course, as we were going through week by week, I wasn't imaginative enough when I first put the syllabus together. And if you go from, say, King of Kings to Greatest Story Ever Told to Jesus of Nazareth, and you realize I'm just seeing the same story, just like different minor variants of the same story over and over again, and without being silly about it. I mean, you know how the story's going to end every time. So where is the tension? Where's the drama? Where's the excitement? I mean, and every Jesus film tries to do that thing of introducing conflict, but you still know how the conflict is going to resolve itself. So it's a real challenge, it seems to me, in how to do something well. But it's not a new thing, of course, doing adaptations of the Jesus story. The idea of attempting to play on the gospel story and to write different versions of it goes back to 4th century at least. I mean, it depends a little on how you define an adaptation, of course, because I mean, what is an original iteration and what's a version of that? But I suppose that's a topic for another day, and we can get sort of canonical bias involved in that as well. But I mean, where does the idea of gospel adaptation begin?
Yeah, I think there's a meaningful sense in which we can see Juvencus as doing something distinctive from other evangelists, including 2nd century evangelists. Mm-hmm. Whereas, Matthew and Luke are writing the same kind of book, and Protevangelium of James is sort of writing a prequel to the Gospels. Juvencus and then Proba and Nonnus following after him are, I think, doing something we could recognize as adaptation. That is, they're taking a different, and in this case, popular medium, and translating the gospel into that medium. So Juvencus wrote a book called The Books of the Gospels, the Libri Evangeliorum, and it was a harmony of the 4 Gospels that was written in dactylic hexameter, which is the epic meter that Homer and Virgil's Aeneid were written in. And he says right in the intro to this that this is meant to be a rival to pagan poetry. He doesn't use the word pagan, it's the rival to Homer and Virgil. And it seems, we don't have a lot more information about what's going on here, but it seems, Proba might be a little bit more fruitful there, but it seems that this is something like an equivalent of making a Jesus movie. This is somebody taking the epic, the mainstream form of entertaining literature might be a bit loose to describe the role Homer and Virgil played in the ancient imaginary, but taking that and using that medium to tell the story of the gospel. And Juvencus in particular Juvencus and Proba both they don't seem to be trying to replace or rewrite the 4 canonical gospels. They're very deferential towards the traditional scripture. They seem instead to be trying to rewrite the epics of their culture.
What kind of date is Juvencus again?
Juvencus is writing in 330-ish, and then Proba's shortly thereafter. And actually, her later date may be really interesting if she's writing in response to Julian the Apostate's rulings about who can use what kind of books. Shall I go into talking about that?
I tell you,
I'm learning.
Yeah, I'm learning here too. Fast. Could I ask as well? But how popular were Juvencus and Probus? I mean, do we have any indication of whether these were kind of widespread classics in antiquity?
Yes. So Juvencus, I don't know a lot about. I don't think there's a lot of evidence we have about how popular that was. But we know Proba's books were really popular. They were really popular as pedagogical books. They were used in schools and in teaching. And we have 2 different authors, Isidore of Seville and the so-called Galatian Decree, that actually condemn Proba as an apocryphal gospel. But at the same time, Isidore says, while this is usually classed as an apocryphal gospel, everyone recognizes that Proba was a genius. That this is a brilliant move to write the gospel this way. So we have reason to think, and then Jerome may have also attacked or criticized Proba, although without naming her.
So the kind of thing that Laura was talking about with Ben-Hur and the question of how do you create a version of the Jesus story that will not offend the pious or the faithful is actually quite ancient then, because if you've already got this question of, well, is it legitimate to do this? Is it legitimate to place fresh words into Jesus's mouth and that's so this goes back almost as long as we can trace it.
Yeah. Right. I mean, there's an interesting difference, I think, between Nonnus and Juvencus on one hand and Proba on the other hand, where Nonnus and Juvencus seem to be trying to stay pretty close to the canonical Gospels. They are just sort of... Nonnus, I've actually gone through and translated a bunch of, and you can often see word-for-word correspondence where he's taken a word from the Gospel of John and then rewritten it to fit the meter of the poetry. So he's being very conservative. It's something closer to Ben-Hur, Jesus speaking in King James version language, whereas Probe is doing something radically different. But we can... Sorry, go ahead.
It's fascinating on the analogy with King James English, because when Laura was speaking about Ben-Hur, I was thinking about Dorothy L. Sayers' really popular series of radio plays, Man Born to be King. My parents used to have a cassette recording of this, and it wasn't actually the original version by Dorothy L. Sayers, but it was a second version that it's been adapted several times on BBC Radio. And I found it as a child listening to it incredibly old-fashioned sounding. I mean, it just didn't, to me, have any kind of dramatic resonance at all. It's only much more recently when I got hold of a copy of the script. It's quite easy to get used, although I got a lovely first edition actually, but it's quite easy to get a used copy. And she is trying so hard, Dorothy L. Sayers, to be reverential, and the way of being reverential is making everybody talk in the King James version style,
right?
And it to me it reads incredibly dated. But when you look at reactions from the time, from the 50s and later, you see people responding as if to say, you know, what is this? It's not exactly calling it blasphemy, but a lot of people thought it was irreverent to play with the Jesus story.
There's an interesting tension there between the need to sort of sound ancient in the voice of Jesus, because that seems more faithful to us. But I think one thing that I'm hearing in all these descriptions of different adaptations of Jesus is that there's sort of this ubiquitous impulse among Christians throughout history to tell the Jesus story in a popular culture medium, right? So, you know, with Juvencus, it's sort of replicating the epic poem, but in Jesus style, or, you know, in the 19th century popular novel, or in the 1950s blockbuster, or in a modern sci-fi
medieval
action
Jesus
movie.
plays were really popular. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess what I wonder is what is the impulse there? Why do people want to tell the gospel story without the gospel, so to speak? You know, why is the reading of the gospel not sufficient for Christian creative energies? You know,
it's a great question. I think part of the problem is that when you look at films that do what you might call a straight adaptation of the Gospels, in the sense that they simply give you the dialogue of the Gospels and you know, have it acted out with pictures, it is unbelievably boring to watch. And I mean, this is coming from someone who is absolutely immersed in the Gospels, and I can't stop going back and reading and rereading. And still, if I put on I mean, I'll give you one example. The Visual Bible Gospel of Matthew, which is the complete text of Matthew's Gospel, even ticking away on the corner of the screen, you get like 1-1, 1-2, 1-3.
That's terrible.
It's so boring. I mean, it's actually okay to excerpt bits of it, and I suspect that in a way that's been its legacy, that you can actually pull out a little bit of, say, Jesus doing a passage from the Sermon on the Mount and watch just that, and it's okay. But there's something about taking the gospel narrative and doing it as a straight drama they're not written as drama. Therefore, it's very difficult to make them work. And you've got these impossible things like the presence of a narrator. Now, how do you do that without it being artificial? I mean,
right.
if you have, you could do the thing which they've done in, say, some adaptations of Thackeray and other modern things, where you actually have a narrator present on screen at the beginning. So I mean, there was a recent adaptation of Vanity Fair where you actually have a character that they call Thackeray. They didn't call him the narrator, but they call him Thackeray. And he just introduces the action and talks as the narrator. And that arguably works better than having a voice booming from the sidelines. Because in King of Kings, it's Orson Welles. And it should be absolutely fantastic, and it's not. I just hear Orson Welles' voice, and I think, oh my goodness, what are they trying to do? You know, I mean, it's where you should be thinking, wow, Orson Welles is what you should be thinking. He really sounds like God, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, actually, yeah. And that's the other thing, of course, people sometimes do. They make the narrator, they make the voice of the narrator also the voice of God.
Right.
Which is a terrible
I think that's
mistake.
the Ten Commandments.
Oh, is it
move,
right? Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, no. Actually, in Ten Commandments, the narrator is Cecil B. DeMille, and the voice of God is a heavily distorted Charlton Heston. Like, they really wanted him to be unrecognizable. Yeah. So they put all these vocal distortions on him so he would sound impersonal, I guess. I don't know.
Before we move past the 4th century, I do want to talk about Proba just a little bit. No. And it actually kind of works as an answer to one of Laura's question, is we actually may know in the case of Proba what motivated her. She doesn't actually tell us all this. But scholars have pointed out that this seems to have been composed shortly after Julian banned the use of pagan books for Christian education and vice versa. And Proba, unlike Juvencus and Nonnus, isn't simply rewriting the gospel as in Homeric meter or epic meter, but is writing a canto, where she actually, every single line of her poem is a line from Virgil, either his Aeneid or his Georgics or his other work. And so every single line is drawn out of, is exactly Virgil's line. And this is not an innovation. Irenaeus describes Homeric cantos earlier, and we have surviving pagan cantos being used for all sorts of things, wedding speeches and humorous things, as well as, it seems, serious poetry, whatever that means. But this may have been a way of getting around the ban on Christians using pagan literature. If you want to, you need to be an intelligent Roman citizen, you need to be familiar with Virgil. And this is a way of reading Virgil as Christian literature, which is really interesting. And the fact that it's received, it seems, in a pedagogical context may offer some weak support for this interpretation.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I can't let the moment go by to remark on how fascinating it is that here we have an important female writer in Christian antiquity.
Yeah. Possibly
what
the
do
first.
we know about her? What do we know about her?
Very little, outside of just some spare comments by Isidore later on. And Proba herself says she had previously written books about wars. So we have, and there's even a debate over whether or not it's this Proba or her granddaughter, who is also named Proba.
Oh.
And we know a good deal about that latter person. She has correspondence with Jerome and Pelagius and things like that. But the scholarship seems inclined to say it's this earlier, more obscure figure. But you're right. She is probably, depending on what you think about the Acts of Perpetua, the little first-person section in there, and then if we do take this earlier Proba, that puts her before Egeria, which makes her the first female author, Christian author, who's extant, which is fascinating.
It really is. And for anyone that's not read Egeria, I strongly recommend looking at her as she was what, 5th century?
380s, isn't she?
Oh, is she as early as that? Oh gosh,
I think so.
This will teach me to go in without doing any prep. But she was a pilgrim, right? And she talks about her experience of walking around the sites that Jesus had, through Jerusalem and so on. Is that right?
Yep. She does this big long road trip and she visits all these sacred sites, which is, It's an amazing narrative.
Wonderful.
And often the first attestation to lots of, she's like the first attestation to the cult of Thecla, which we have earlier, Acts of Thecla and things like that. But she like describes coming across people who are, I don't know what word to use, venerating Thecla. I'm not sure if that's anachronistic or not, but...
Or at least remembering her. Yeah, yeah. No, how fascinating.
But unlike, because she's using Aeneas, using the Aeneid to rewrite the gospel, Jesus actually comes out significantly different in Proba's text. I mean, there's physical descriptions of Jesus as this epic hero figure, which, stands out as distinct from the gospels, which we get no physical description from. And, of course, often people, in light of Isaiah, think of Jesus as being kind of unremarkable. And then Jesus curses the Jewish people from the cross, which is this, quite the opposite of what happens in the Gospel of Luke, of course. Wow. And we do have a few, there's a textual variant where the people pronounce woes upon themselves. That's the closest thing you find in any canonical, quote-unquote canonical texts. But it's a remarkable thing. And also, this is from an article by Elizabeth Clark, actually, Duke's own, and talks about how Jesus being cast in the role of Aeneas in some ways becomes the founder of a nation, in this case not Rome but the Christian nation. Mm-hmm. So okay, Proba, I feel I've done her justice.
It's marvelous.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm feeling educated, and now I'm desperate to go and read more about her, and for that matter, Juvencus. It is one of the dangers of even talking about it. When I was introducing all of us at the beginning, I felt very self-conscious when I said New Testament track, because I actually don't like the title New Testament as typifying the thing we study, because people who only study the New Testament do not know the New Testament. And we really try and conceptualize ourselves as being people who study the origins of Christianity, early Christianity. I don't really care too much how one speaks about it, but one of the dangers of our field is that there is a lot of ignorance, and I'm putting my hand up here about things like what we're talking about today. So I'm grateful to you for opening them up to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
How long are we going to put off Jesus Christ Superstar?
Yeah. Well,
I think, let's talk about Jesus Christ Superstar. Why not?
The thing that really gathered us here together today is geek out over our shared love of Jesus Christ Superstar, which I have to admit, Ian actually introduced me to. I'm really embarrassed to admit that.
I was shocked that you'd never seen it.
I know. I was such an Andrew Lloyd Webber fangirl as a kid because of Phantom, and I think Jesus Christ Superstar probably wouldn't have really flown in the circles I was raised in, just because in some ways it is a bit heterodox in the way it presents the life of Jesus.
Funny story about that. My grandfather was a leader of a protest of Jesus Christ Superstar. And at the same time, my mother, they went to a Lutheran church, my mother secretly went and bought the vinyl and memorized all the lyrics while my grandfather was protesting it.
Oh, that's great.
So it's one of my favorite Ian stories.
Yes, and then, of course, by the time my mom has me, Jesus Christ Superstar was not played in our household and would not have been tolerated. But then, as an adult, 21 or something like that, it came on one Easter, and that's the first time I discovered it. I was it was still an undergrad, and they introduced it to me, my own parents, which is funny. There's probably a story to be told there that I don't quite understand. But
when you say it came on at Easter, which version of the show was it?
It was actually the first version I saw was the 90s one, which is a real shame. Do I have the dates right there, Mark? The 1970s is the first one.
It's 1973 is what I like to think of as the original and the best.
Yeah,
yes,
the one that's and then there's like a stage show version, right?
Yes.
Was the second in the 90s or the 2000s?
It's about 2000. It's about the millennium. I haven't got that. I like that version, but to me it still doesn't compete with the 1973 version.
Absolutely
agreed.
Not.
Annas and Caiaphas, I think, are better in the 2000
they are.
version.
That's actually very true. Yeah.
But other than that, I take the 70s.
It's funny, I actually grew up with it as a child. I don't even remember the first time that I heard it. My parents had the album in the house, the vinyl of the 1973 version. And so I grew up just knowing all of the songs. And I remember So in British public schools, you have to teach religion. It's one of these sort of great anomalies about the UK that they teach religion in schools, but nobody goes to church or anything like that. But we used to have Jesus Christ Superstar often in our religious studies classes. I remember my religious studies teacher, Mr. Heather, at school, popping it on the TV and showing us clips from it. And it was so it was part of our education really into the Jesus story. I did used to worry about aspects of the characterization of Jesus in it. And I think probably the thing that used to worry me most was how weak Jesus is a lot of the time. Yeah. And how I used to, even as a teenager, I used to think, well, would anybody follow that man? You know, I mean, he doesn't seem terribly charismatic to me. That used to bother me. But consequently also, though, I think that's why the Gethsemane scene really works in Jesus Christ Superstar, because if you do have a Jesus who is utterly vulnerable and full of this angst, you actually believe it. And I used to get really emotional watching the Gethsemane scene, listening to it.
Oh, I still
terribly
do.
much. Yeah, well,
it's incredible.
No, absolutely.
I think part of the anxious, vulnerable Jesus, I think part of why it works in that musical is that we only see Jesus for 1 week, right? So there's a lot left to the imagination, I think, of what Jesus has been like before he was staring down his imminent death. And Judas seems to, when Judas sets up the story in the first song, where he's, basically laying out what the stakes are and what he's worried about is going to happen. I think there's an indication that we're only really seeing the tip of the iceberg. Right. But then the actor who plays Jesus doesn't have to portray that side of Jesus too. Right, we only catch Passion Week Jesus. Yeah. And I think that works really well and is one of the reasons why Jesus Christ Superstar is such a successful adaptation as opposed to the more epic approach generally. Or Godspell, for heaven's sake.
Right.
Sorry.
Oh Lord.
I was just gonna say, Nazareth, your famous son, should have stayed a great unknown. Like his father carving wood, he'd have made good. Tables, chairs, and oaken chests would have suited Jesus best. He'd have caused no body harm, no one alarm. I'm not going to sing it, but yes,
I think we were all about to burst into song with you. Right?
So hard to resist, isn't it? Whenever I do my Jesus in Film course, I have to struggle so hard to resist actually singing bits of it because it wouldn't be a pleasant sound for anybody there. But you're absolutely right, Laura. That I think Too Much Heaven, the first proper song after the overture, which Judas sings, actually contextualizes the whole as we have had this amazing time, and he has been, this incredible figure that people absolutely adore and everything. So you sort of take all that for granted, and then home in on this last week of his life.
Right. No talk of God, then we called you a man, and believe me, my admiration for you hasn't died.
Right.
Like Laura said, it points back to that Judas still admires this guy.
Yeah. Do you? But I mean, some people. A friend of mine, who's also a New Testament scholar, said that he just can't bear the lyrics in it. He doesn't like the kind of cheesy rhymes. But I actually think that's part of the joy of it. I mean, Tim Rice. He's the guy who. In another musical, rhymed Buddha with woulda, as in would have. Now, you might think that's terrible. I think it's genius. Yeah.
It's just a different era of writing. I tend to have a fair amount of grace for that kind of thing, but
this does give me an opportunity to say I once met Tim Rice. It was a lot of people have forgotten that he wrote a musical with Bjorn and Benny from ABBA, and as a big ABBA fan, I went, of course, to the premiere of Chess in October 1984 at the Barbican in London, and this is a bit naughty, actually. I actually sneaked into the rehearsals and watched them all.
Wow.
and Bjorn and Benny and Tim Rice were just sort of hanging out there, so we chatted, and I wish to goodness. I mean, those days we didn't carry phones with cameras on them, so I didn't get the chance to get a pic with him, but it did honestly happen.
That is
That's
astonishing.
amazing.
I love that.
Not of direct relevance to what we're talking about, but I suppose it's part of the same. It's the fact that people still love listening to Lloyd Webber stuff, whether with Tim Rice or anybody else, actually does mean that Jesus Christ Superstar has. It's got a legacy in a way that lots of other things haven't, and so you were just about to mention Godspell. I think you did, and I might have very rudely talked over you, Laura. So tell me what you think about. I want to hear what you think about Godspell.
Oh gosh, so I do not have any experience with Godspell outside of the movie, and I understand, again, this is a different time, and I know that a lot of people really, I really do think it might be the worst movie I've ever seen. And I've seen 33 AD Assassin, or whatever it's called. No, I find that movie just unbelievably grating, and I think it's a really interesting companion piece to Jesus Christ Superstar, which posits a very vulnerable and grim and sort of like thoroughgoing darkness to the Passion Week story, whereas Godspell is just cotton candy fluff, silliness, and it's
don't forget the grimdark giant robotic Jew who comes on the screen.
There is the Robo Jew, which is
oh my god,
that is the most peculiar thing ever, isn't it? That's the adaptation of Matthew 23. Alas, alas for you, lawyers and Pharisees, hypocrites that you be. Now, that's talking about terrible rhymes. You see, that does great with me. Anytime that in poetry you have that you be, then you know.
That's not how people talk.
And also that's not, and of course that's not what's really bad about that. But for anyone that hasn't seen Godspell, the film of Godspell, directed by David Green, is actually the same year as Jesus Christ Superstar, 1973. And I think it's really interesting to contrast it with Jesus Christ Superstar and say, why is it that it doesn't work when Jesus Christ Superstar does? Because it's not necessarily the music. I mean, the guy writing the music is Stephen Schwartz, who has written, countless.
He did Wicked, didn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And he's done Disney film
slouch.
scores and everything. Yeah, I mean, the guy is a brilliant composer, and some of the tunes are kind of okay in Godspell. I mean, that's the most praise I can give, because I still struggle even with some of the tunes. But
Godspell. I mean, like Laura said, like the darkness of Jesus Christ Superstar. I don't think it's not just dark. It's very Schweitzer-ian, right?
Yeah.
It's everyone around Jesus interprets him as an apocalyptic prophet for the most part, and then Jesus seems to see himself as sort of the way Schweitzer interpreted the apocalyptic prophet, as the guy who's going to throw himself on the wheel and just wants to be guaranteed that he'll be remembered. And so there's this sort of like, Jesus is already kind of commenting on his own memory, while as everyone around him views, like, there's a sort of sophistication to that, as opposed to Godspell, which is this weird combination of American Protestant piety, a lot of like, be near to me, I want to be close to you.
There's a lot of in steps, kind of. Yeah.
Combined with, the thing opens with a long quote from Plato's Apology. And the disciples are named Jean-Paul Sartre and Socrates. And so there's this weird, trying to combine trendy 70s, humanistic approaches to Jesus with this sort of just, relational piety that I think it's almost incoherent. While Judas is betraying Jesus, the disciples are singing about the importance of daring. They're going to put a pebble in their shoe and call it daring, and it's nonsense.
Equally, the fact. No, go for it, Laura.
I was just saying the on top of all that, the aesthetic is just so toothless, right? Like, it's just it is just thoroughgoing simple carbs in the aesthetic, right? So I think that adds to the incoherence of, it's not clear who this Jesus is. It's not clear why he's in conflict with people, and while you have all this thematic incoherence going on with the score and the lyrics, the aesthetic gives us no hint for how we're supposed to be interpreting this.
Right.
So,
it's to me, it's like it actually makes my hair stand on end at points. I find it so excruciating. But to me, it's like church drama. There's a sort of this will sound. I do apologise to anyone listening who's involved with church drama. I'm sure that your church drama is excellent, but it's the kind of church drama that it's people affecting a happiness that you just don't believe, affecting a kind of amusement. I mean, so take a sort of concrete example. The stuff about from the Gospels, from Luke 6, the log and the speck, where I actually think that is quite a funny passage of the Gospels. Jesus is basically saying that you're trying to pick the speck out of your brother's eye, and you've got a log in your own eye is the thing, and it's reasonably amusing idea, and they do that line in Godspell. And everybody just stands around going, "Ooh, really?" Ooh, and you're thinking, no, it's actually quite a funny line. If you'd have done it properly, you actually could have made it funny, And it's that sort of affected joy, a sort of scripted joy, which actually ends up just being nauseating, to me at least.
There's such a huge difference between it. It's hard to define it, but there's such a huge difference between genuinely joyful filmmaking and like toothless, fake happy filmmaking. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if the difference is the sincerity of the performers, or it's hard to put your finger on, but it just doesn't.
I have another personal story with Godspell really quick, which is that a trip to go see Godspell performed by an acting company was the very first date I went on with Jodie, who is now my wife.
I thought so.
We were in high school, and we drove to La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is another town we did not live in, to go view this play. And we both loved musicals. And we both walked away saying, that was kind of bad.
So, are there any redeeming features in Godspell? Because I think there are a couple.
Prepare Ye the Way of the Lord is a perfectly decent song, mostly because you just repeat that line over and over again in an interesting tune.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think the two redeeming things, at least in the film, that's the only version I've seen, are... So for one thing, for people that haven't seen the film, it's actually set in New York, and the film begins kind of brilliantly with the hustle and bustle of 1973 New York City, Manhattan, and then basically the streets kind of clear, and then for the rest of the film you only have Jesus and these disciples that for some reason turn against him at the end, sort of thing. And then when you get right to the end of the film, everything goes back to the hustle and bustle of Manhattan again, and that's a nice framing device. And I think the other thing that I personally find, at the very least, a fascinating bit of film archive is simply seeing them dancing during the song "All for the Best," which actually is a pretty good song, memorable ditty. During the song "All for the Best," they're actually in all sorts of places in Manhattan, including Times Square, where there's this fantastic dance sequence with the Jesus and Judas characters in front of in Times Square. And there's a great YouTube video you can go and look at about how they filmed that. And it took, just for about 20 seconds, it took them a whole day of filming to get it right. And then the song ends at the top of the Twin Towers, one of the Twin Towers. And because they've only just very recently been constructed, you can still see kind of cement makers on the top there and bits of construction equipment and all the rest of it. And looking at it now and seeing them on the top of one of the Twin Towers is quite breathtaking, actually, just as a piece of film archive, regardless of what you think of the film itself. So that I could watch over and over again just because of seeing a piece of history, really.
The disturbing thing about that sequence is the song All for the Best being sung on top of the Twin Towers and with the Twin Towers in the background. The song is all about how when bad things happen, just be happy because in heaven you'll be blessed. It's singing about how it's not... Yeah, go ahead, Laura.
It's for one thing. I mean, part of it is I just hate that message and I hate that theology so
Right.
much. So, like, I do blame the filmmakers for just writing that. But obviously, the significance that the Twin Towers have, I think maybe this might also just be the millennial imagination too. Obviously, I don't blame Godspell for not anticipating that, but I truly do think that I find that sequence terrifying. I think it is incredibly creepy. I think there's just something about the juxtaposition of, I when they suddenly smash cut to the Twin Towers, my brain puts a plane flying into it, and it is just so creepy.
Interesting. Yeah, see, yeah, carry on.
I just wanted to say the message of the song is horrible. I mean, one of the lines is, "Someone's got to be oppressed." Yes, it's all for the best.
And it's not you monsters.
And I mean, it could be more. It's don't forget that when you get to heaven, you'll be blessed. So just put up with being oppressed here and terrible things happening to you. It's remarkable.
Yeah, that's
and they
point.
couldn't have picked a more horrifying set future looking. They couldn't have picked a more horrifying set for that song, unless they had just like staged it in, I don't know, the National Holocaust Museum. But
God.
I
suppose it's
horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I hadn't really thought of that until you mentioned it. I suppose insofar as I thought about it at all, the lyrics, I just thought that they were typical Godspell silliness. That,
right.
Without any, but now you say it, I suppose it really, and then the fact that it is on the Twin Towers makes you, it kind of, in a rather horrible, unanticipated way, draws out the really problematic theology of the lyrics. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah. So,
it's quite sinister, I think.
Even without the post 9/11 context,
exactly,
they're on the World Trade Centers, the symbol of business, and singing that some people get the good cut of meat and we don't. And, it's all for the best, because when we get to heaven, then we'll get the good cut of meat.
Right.
And someone's got to be oppressed. And, I don't understand what's happening here.
No, it's very sinister. That's...
No, I think you've talked me round to realising that even the bit of the film that I actually thought I liked...
even that's terrible.
is actually, even that's terrible, and actually might be even worse than anything else.
It might be the worst part of the whole movie, I think.
I mean, the strange thing is, just to sort of justify my not having thought about it in those terms at all, is that I did spend quite a while trying to grab screenshots of the Twin Towers to try and work out exactly where they were, just to take it as a piece of archive, as it were. So my thoughts were on that. But gosh, you are right. You see, there I was not really listening to it. I mean, the other side of it that I do find problematic is that I'm so worried that they're going to fall off the edge. I mean, they are dancing. I have a real fear of heights. I mean, I can I can go up. I mean, I've been up to the top of the Empire State Building, and and there's no way that you're going to fall off there because there's all guards around and all the rest of it. But even then, I was still terrified to go up to the edge, and my family will tell you, I mean, whereas they're all dangling their phones out, all the rest of it, But so I mean, to see people dancing on the edge of it, that actually is the one bit that affected me more than anything else there.
Yeah, well, if there's anything else we accomplished by this show, I'm glad Ian and I were able to talk Mark into seeing that there's nothing good about Godspell.
Right, I think thank you for that.
The opening quote, reading Socrates, or the Plato's Apology, I actually think is kind of brilliant. That there's a strong parallelism. And if they had just gone, just told this as sort of a parallel to, Jesus is kind of like Socrates in these interesting ways. If they'd stuck with that the whole way through, that would have been a fascinating musical. Of course, they didn't do anything close to that. They have a robotic caricature of a Jewish person directly crucifying Jesus. So,
Yeah.
Well, why does Jesus die is always a really interesting question in these, I think. In every Jesus film kind of has to answer that in its own way, because the Gospels do equivocate a bit about that. So where people fill in the gaps, whether consciously or unconsciously, I think is a really interesting question, because it seems like in Godspell, it's, you have Jesus who's kind of being killed by concepts almost, like he's just too beautiful for this world, so he dies. Whereas Jesus Christ Superstar puts a very deliberate stake down on the political reasons why Jesus would die. And I'm not saying they nail it from a historical perspective at all, but they're very comfortable putting it in history. And Godspell does not at all.
Right. So. And in fact, both, I mean, the crucifixion scene is ludicrous in Godspell, it seems to me. I mean, there is no reason for them to be doing this that the narrative's provided, and even the crucifixion is basically him being pushed up against a kind of fence with some
an electric
red
fence.
Yeah. Is it supposed to be electric fences? It's a while since I've seen. And then
that's my memory.
And then they've got some red handkerchiefs to represent the sort of blood and that, and then they sort of carry him. Don't they carry? They
sing "Long Live God" and carry his corpse
with the corpse, which sort of makes sense in a sort of post God is dead kind of world. Is that what it was called? That whole 1960s movement, the sort of
God is dead theology.
God is dead, yeah, and it's sort of carrying a corpse around and singing about the resurrection. I mean, that's where Jesus Christ Superstar is so much superior, because you just end. I mean, you just end the film, which of course offended lots of Christians and still does that it ends there. But I mean, it means as a viewer you haven't got to cope with the ludicrously fake resurrection scene in Godspell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and part of the other thing too is I think Jesus Christ Superstar, it has one less tool in the film version that it does live, because live, when Jesus comes out for the curtain call, he's normally not still wearing his crucifixion makeup, right?
Right.
Like they take his stage makeup off. So it's, it's sort of, the curtain call itself takes the place of a resurrection. But obviously movies don't have curtain calls. So instead we just sort of have a distant shot of an empty cross and do with that what you will.
Yeah. So someone pointed out to me once that that you can actually see a shepherd walking across in front of the sunset when you have the empty cross. So there might just be a hint of a resurrection.
Does Jesus not get back on the bus at the end of Jesus
No.
Christ
No,
Superstar?
he does not.
No, he's not there. They've left Ted Neely behind.
Yeah, no. And only 3 of them, while they're getting on the bus, look back at the cross, I guess to check on him. I don't know. It's Herod, Pilate, and Mary Magdalene.
Oh, is that right?
Are the 3, and then Judas is the last one.
Mm-hmm.
But
yes, even Judas gets back on the cross. I mean, sorry, back on the bus.
Back on the bus.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the other thing which about the resurrection in Jesus Christ Superstar, the song Superstar, which comes before the crucifixion, does depict Jesus back in bright raiment again. I mean, Judas has got the really shiny stuff, but Jesus. So even though you could say you've got the kind of time inverted there, and you have an implied resurrection, ascension, and then Jesus is being cross-examined as if it's 1973, when
right,
it comes
but
to
at that point, we're totally out of history.
Right,
It's just sort of Andrew Lloyd Webber shows his cards and talks in the voice of Judas about his questions about Jesus. So I think that you could, again, it's all very ambivalent. You could take it as the resurrection, or you could take it as Jesus of, like, the Christ of faith, basically, is the one being interrogated at that point. Jesus as we remember him, not as he was.
Yeah, I do think it actually works for all those sorts of reasons. I mean, I'm skeptical even about the ending of Jesus of Montreal, where you have an implied resurrection. I mean, there's this big spoiler for everybody, but you've had 30 or 40 years to see it. At the end, Jesus, there's a heart. Jesus's heart is transplanted into somebody else. Even that, I there's part of me that thinks, did we really have to have a resurrection parallel at the end? I think it takes away from some of the joy of the film. But we have been going for an hour, so we should probably wrap up. It shows that there maybe is mileage in having another geek out at some point.
No, this is fun.
This was a lot of fun, Mark. Thank you.
Great.